The rope bit into Esperanza's wrists as they bound her to the wagon wheel in the blazing Texas sun. Her white wedding dress, now torn and stained with dust, caught the wind like a mockery of hope. The people of Cedar Ridge gathered in a semicircle. Around her, their faces twisted with righteous anger and something uglier beneath. Sheriff Hawkins unfolded a paper with theatrical precision. His voice carried across the town square like a judgment from on high. The charges rang out one by one. Fraud, theft, disturbing the peace. Each word fell on Esperanza like stones, but she kept her chin raised. Her dark eyes swept the crowd, searching for one face that might show mercy. She found none. Thomas Caldwell stood behind his mother, Martha, his shoulders curved inward like a man trying to disappear. He would not meet her gaze. 3 weeks ago, he had written letters calling her his salvation. Now he looked at her like she was his shame. The crowd pressed closer. Someone threw a rotten apple that splattered against the wagon wheel near her head. Another hurled dust that stung her eyes. The jeers grew louder, feeding on themselves like wildfire. Martha Caldwell watched it all with cold satisfaction. Her gray hair was pulled back so tight it seemed to stretch her features into something sharp and predatory. She had orchestrated this moment with the precision of a conductor leading an orchestra of hate. The sun climbed higher. Sweat beaded on Esperanza's forehead, but she refused to let them see her break. She had survived worse than this. She had nursed dying soldiers who called her angel with their last breath. She had buried the only man who ever called her daughter. She would not crumble before these people who knew nothing of real suffering. A movement at the edge of the crowd caught her attention. A figure emerged from between the buildings like smoke taking human form. He was tall and lean, with copper skin and black hair that hung to his shoulders. He moved with the fluid grace of someone who had learned to walk without disturbing the earth beneath his feet. The crowd had not noticed him yet. They were too drunk on their own righteousness to see the danger approaching. Esperanza watched him slide through their ranks like a knife through fabric, silent, purposeful, deadly. He stopped directly in front of her. His eyes met hers for one long moment. They were dark as winter nights and just as unforgiving. But there was something else there too. Recognition. Not of her face, but of her situation. Of what it meant to be bound and helpless while others decided your fate. His hand moved to the knife at his belt. The blade caught the sunlight as he drew it free. The crowd's chatter died away as they finally noticed him. Fear rippled through their ranks like a stone dropped in still water. Sheriff Hawkins reached for his gun, but the stranger was already moving. The rope parted under his blade with a whisper. Esperanza's hands fell free, blood rushing back into her fingers like liquid fire. The stranger straightened and faced the crowd. When he spoke, his English came slow and broken, each word carefully chosen. This wrong. The silence stretched taut as a bowstring. 100 people stood frozen, caught between rage and terror. They had come to see justice served, but now they faced something they had not expected. Resistance. Sheriff Hawkins found his voice first. "You're interfering with the law, Indian." The stranger did not respond. He turned back to Esperanza and extended his hand. She hesitated for only a heartbeat before taking it. His palm was rough with calluses, warm and solid. He pulled her to her feet with gentle strength. Martha Caldwell's voice cut through the tension like a whip crack. "Stop them, they're escaping." But the crowd was too shocked to move. The stranger and Esperanza walked backwards slowly, never taking their eyes off the mob. When they reached the edge of the square, they turned and ran. They darted between buildings, down alleys thick with shadows and the smell of horse manure. Esperanza's wedding dress caught on thorns and fence posts, tearing away pieces of her ruined dreams with each step. Behind them, voices rose in pursuit, but they had already vanished into the maze of Cedar Ridge's back streets. The stranger led her to an abandoned grain silo on the town's outskirts. Its wooden walls were weathered gray and split with age. He pushed open a warped door and gestured for her to enter. Inside, shafts of sunlight fell through gaps in the boards, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny spirits. Esperanza sank to the floor, her legs finally giving out. The rope, burns on her wrists, throbbed with each heartbeat. She looked up at the man who had saved her. This stranger who had risked everything for someone he did not know. Why? The word came out as barely a whisper. He crouched down beside her, studying her face with those winter-dark eyes. I watch this town. I see what they do to people like us. People like us. The words hung in the dusty air between them. Esperanza understood. In the eyes of Cedar Ridge, they were both less than human, both expendable, both worthy of whatever cruelty others chose to inflict. My name is Esperanza. He nodded once. Ayana. She pulled her torn skirts closer around her legs, trying to find some dignity in the wreckage of her appearance. They said I was a thief, a fraud. Are you? The question was direct, without judgment. Esperanza met his gaze. No. I came here to marry Thomas Caldwell. I brought my savings, $200 in gold. His mother decided I was not suitable. Ayana's expression did not change, but something flickered in his eyes. So they made you into a criminal? Yes? He was quiet for a long moment, listening to the sounds of pursuit growing closer. Voices called back and forth across the town. Dogs barked. Horses' hooves thundered on packed earth. They will not stop looking, he said finally. Esperanza knew he was right. Martha Caldwell would not rest until she was dead or driven so far, away she could never return to tell the truth. The woman had too much to lose. As if reading her thoughts, Ayana stood and moved to the door. He peered through a crack in the wood. We must go soon. We? He turned back to her. You think you can survive alone out there? Esperanza looked down at her torn wedding dress, at the rope burns on her wrists, at the impossible situation she found herself in. 3 hours ago, she had been preparing to start a new life. Now she was a fugitive with nothing but the clothes on her back and the kindness of a stranger. I don't even know who you are, she said. Ayana moved away from the door and crouched beside her again. This time he was close enough that she could see the old scars on his hands, the careful way he held himself, the weight of secrets in his dark eyes. Does it matter? Right now we are both hunted, both alone, both have nowhere else to go. Outside, the voices were getting closer. Soon they would search every building, every hiding place. There was no time left for doubt or careful consideration. Esperanza pushed herself to her feet. Her legs were steadier now, fed by necessity and the faint spark of hope that, maybe, just maybe, she might survive this after all. Where do we go? Ayana smiled for the first time since she had met him. It transformed his face, making him look younger and somehow more dangerous. Away from here, far away. They left Cedar Ridge as the sun reached its zenith, moving through mesquite thickets that tore at Esperanza's ruined dress. Ayana led the way, his moccasins silent on the rocky ground while her wedding shoes crunched through dried leaves. Like broken promises. By evening, the wanted posters had sprouted like weeds on every fence post and tree trunk they passed. Esperanza's face stared back at her from crude sketches, her features distorted by the artist's prejudice. The bounty made her stomach clench. $100 for her capture. $200 for Ayana, dead or alive. They made camp in a dry creek bed, sheltered by overhanging rocks. No fire, no light. Just the two of them and the vast Texas sky pressing down like a judgment they could not escape. Ayana sat with his back against stone, watching the darkness beyond their hiding place. His stillness was complete, as if he had learned to become part of the landscape itself. Esperanza envied that ability. Her own nerves jangled like broken glass with every night sound. How long have you been watching Cedar Ridge? She asked. He turned his head slightly. In the moonlight, his profile looked carved from the same rock that sheltered them. Long enough. The non-answer hung between them like smoke. Esperanza pulled her knees to her chest, trying to conserve warmth. The desert night was cold in ways she had not expected. Cold that seeped through torn fabric and settled in her bones. You speak English better than you let on, she said. This time his silence stretched longer. When he finally spoke, His careful, broken accent was gone, replaced by words that flowed smooth as river water. Stupid Indians are less threatening than smart ones. People tell secrets around stupid Indians, share plans, forget we have ears. The transformation was startling. This was not the same man who had said this wrong in the town square. This was someone far more dangerous, someone who had been playing a role so carefully that even she had been fooled. What kind of secrets? Ayana's jaw tightened. The kind that get people killed. Morning brought the sound of horses in the distance. Ayana was on his feet before Esperanza had fully awakened, his hand already reaching for his knife. Through the rocks above them, they could see riders silhouetted against the dawn sky. Sheriff Hawkins and his posse, spreading out in a search pattern that would bring them directly to the creek bed. They moved like ghosts through the mesquite, Ayana leading with the confidence of someone who knew this land like his own skin. Esperanza followed, her torn dress catching on thorns that seemed to reach for her with hungry fingers. Behind them, the voices of their pursuers grew closer. The chase lasted 3 days. 3 days of running through country that grew wilder and more unforgiving with each mile. Esperanza's wedding shoes fell apart on the second day, leaving her feet cut and bleeding. Ayana tore strips from his shirt to bind them, his touch gentle despite the rough fabric. They shared water from hidden springs that Ayana knew by heart. They ate berries and roots that he showed her how to identify. When her strength flagged, he slowed his pace without complaint. When exhaustion made her stumble, he was there to catch her before she fell. On the third evening, they reached a river that ran swift and brown with spring runoff. The sound of pursuit was closer now, close enough to make out individual voices. Sheriff Hawkins calling orders, dogs baying on their scent trail. "Can you swim?" Ayana asked. Esperanza looked at the churning water and shook her head. Fear tightened, her throat like a fist. She had always been afraid of deep water, ever since childhood when she had watched her younger brother swept away by a flood. Ayana studied her face in the fading light. Something in her expression must have told him what words could not, because he nodded once and began stripping bark from a dead cottonwood. "What are you doing?" "Making you float." He worked with quick efficiency, lashing pieces of bark together with strips of hide from his belt. The makeshift raft was crude but sturdy. As he worked, Esperanza could hear the posse getting closer. Voices carried on the evening wind, accompanied by the jingle of harness and the creak of leather. "They're almost here," she whispered. No." He finished the raft and tested its buoyancy in the shallows. The water was cold enough to steal breath, cold enough to stop a heart. But it was better than facing what was coming through the trees behind them. Ayana waded into the current, guiding the raft with one hand while the other supported Esperanza. The water rose to her waist, then her chest. The current pulled at her legs like living things trying to drag her down. "Trust me," he said. She did. She had no choice but to trust this man who had become her salvation and her anchor in a world that wanted to destroy them both. The raft held her weight as they moved into deeper water, Ayana swimming beside her with powerful strokes that fought the current. Behind them, torches appeared on the riverbank. Shouts echoed across the water. Someone fired a rifle, but the shot went wide, lost in darkness and distance. They reached the far side as the first drops of rain began to fall. By the time they pulled themselves onto the muddy bank, the storm had opened up in earnest. Rain fell in sheets that turned the world gray and formless. Their tracks disappeared almost as quickly as they made them. They found shelter in a cave cut into the limestone bluffs, deep enough to hide them from pursuit and wide enough for both to lie down without touching. Esperanza's torn dress clung to her body like a second skin. She shivered uncontrollably. As the temperature dropped with the storm, Ayana gathered dry wood from the back of the cave and built a small fire. The flames threw dancing shadows on the rock walls, creating a pocket of warmth in the cold darkness. For the first time in days, they could rest without listening for the sound of pursuit. The fever started that night. At first, Esperanza thought it was just exhaustion and exposure. But by morning, her skin burned with heat that had nothing to do with the fire. Her vision blurred at the edges. and strange dreams leaked into her, waking thoughts. Ayana pressed his palm to her forehead and cursed softly in his own language. The fever was climbing fast, fed by infection from the cuts on her feet and the stress of their flight. Without medicine, without proper shelter, she might not survive. For 2 days she drifted in and out of consciousness while the fever burned through her like wildfire. In her delirium, she spoke to people who were not there. Her mother sold away when Esperanza was barely old enough to remember her face. The soldiers she had nursed, men who called her angel, but would never see her as their equal. Ayana listened to it all. He bathed her burning skin with cool water from a seep in the cave wall. He forced broth made from roots and herbs down her throat when she was lucid enough to swallow. He never left her side, not even when the fever made her cry out in languages that mixed English with half-remembered African words her grandmother had whispered like prayers. On the 3rd day, the fever broke. Esperanza woke to find Ayana sitting beside the fire, carving something from a piece of white stone. His face was haggard with exhaustion and worry. When he saw her eyes focus on him, relief flooded his features like sunrise. "Welcome back," he said. She tried to sit up and discovered her body felt hollow as an empty gourd. "How long?" 3 days. I thought I was going to lose you." The words carried weight beyond their surface meaning. Esperanza heard what he did not say, saw it in the careful way he watched her face. Somewhere in the space between flight and fever, between shared danger and mutual dependence, something had changed between them. They were no longer just fugitives thrown together by circumstance. They had become something more. Something that had no name but felt solid as the stone walls around them. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving the world washed clean and bright. But inside the cave, beside the dying fire, 2 people who had lost everything discovered they had found something worth keeping: each other. Ayana finished his carving and held it out to her. It was a small bird, wings spread as if caught in the moment before flight. The stone was smooth as silk under her fingers, warm from his hands. "For hope," he said simply. Esperanza closed her fingers around the carving and felt something shift inside her chest. For the first time since Cedar Ridge, she believed they might actually survive this. Together. They smelled the smoke before they saw it. Ayana stopped so suddenly that Esperanza nearly collided with his back. His nostrils flared like a wolf scenting danger. The acrid smell carried on the wind, mixed with something else. Something that made his face go stone hard. The camp should have been nestled in the valley below, hidden among cottonwoods that followed the creek's winding path. Instead, black smoke rose in lazy spirals against the afternoon sky. The trees stood naked and charred, their branches reaching skyward like the arms of supplicants begging for mercy. Ayana moved down the slope with careful steps, his body coiled tight as a spring. Esperanza followed, dread pooling in her stomach like cold water. She had seen burned settlements before during the war. She knew what they would find. The lodges were ash and bone-white poles. Cooking pots lay scattered and dented. Children's toys made from carved wood and painted hide had been trampled into the mud. But no bodies. That mercy at least had been granted. An old woman emerged from behind a boulder, her gray hair loose around her shoulders like a mourning veil. She spoke to Ayana in rapid words that sounded like water over stones. Her hands moved as she talked, painting pictures in the air that Esperanza could not understand but felt in her bones. Ayana's face grew darker with each word. When the woman finished, he stood silent for a long moment, his hands clenched at his sides. The muscle in his jaw worked like he was chewing on something bitter. "What did she say?" Esperanza asked. Sheriff Hawkins kept his promise. 3 camps burned, families scattered, children lost in the chaos. The words hit Esperanza like physical blows. She sank to her knees in the ash-covered ground, her hands coming up to cover her face. This was her fault. Her flight had brought this destruction down on innocent people who had done nothing but exist in the wrong place at the wrong time. "How many?" she whispered. Ayana spoke to the old woman again. Her response was brief, but the pain in her eyes said everything. 43 people in this camp alone, 7 children under 10 years old, all because they gave shelter to the son of a war chief. The words hung in the smoky air like an accusation. Esperanza looked up at him through her fingers, seeing him, clearly for the first time. Not just a scout or a warrior, but something more. Someone whose capture would be seen as a victory worth any price. "You're not just watching settler towns," she said. "You're planning something." Ayana's silence was answer enough. He walked to what had been the center of the camp, where the council fire once burned. Now only a ring of blackened stones remained, scattered like broken teeth. The old woman spoke again, her voice urgent. She pointed toward the setting sun, then made a series of gestures that looked like counting. Ayana nodded grimly. "The main camp is still safe, but not for long. Hawkins is moving against it tomorrow with cavalry support. 100 families, including the survivors from here." Esperanza pushed herself to her feet, ash clinging to her torn dress like gray snow. "Because of us. Because of me." The distinction mattered to him, she could see. As if taking responsibility for her part in this would somehow lessen his guilt. But they both knew the truth. They were bound together now, their fates tangled like rope. What hurt one wounded them both. The old woman approached Esperanza with shuffling steps. Her weathered hands reached out to touch the white woman's face, fingers tracing the line of her cheek with surprising gentleness. When she spoke, her voice was soft as wind through grass. "She says you have the look of someone who has lost everything," Ayana translated. "She recognizes the shape of that grief." Tears threatened to spill from Esperanza's eyes, but she held them back. Crying would not undo the damage they had caused. It would not rebuild the burned lodges or reunite scattered families. "What happens now?" she asked. Ayana's hand moved to the knife at his belt, his fingers wrapping around the handle like it was an old friend. "I end this tonight." The plan was simple and brutal. Ride to Cedar Ridge under cover of darkness, find Sheriff Hawkins, kill him before he could lead the attack on the main camp. It was a suicide mission disguised as strategy, and they both knew it. "There has to be another way," Esperanza said. "What way?" "Talk to them. Reason with people who burn children's homes?" His voice carried the weight of old wounds, old betrayals. How many times had his people tried to make peace, only to have it shattered by fear and greed? How many promises had been broken in the name of progress and manifest destiny? The old woman spoke again, her words sharp with urgency. She gestured toward the horizon where storm clouds were building, dark and heavy with the promise of rain. "She says a messenger came before the attack," Ayana translated. "Someone from Cedar Ridge, a woman with gray hair and hungry eyes. Martha Caldwell." The name hung unspoken between them, but they both understood. This had never been about justice, or protecting the town. It had been about something else entirely. "She's covering her tracks," Esperanza said. "Getting rid of witnesses." The pieces began to fall into place like cards in a rigged game. Martha's eagerness to have Esperanza publicly shamed, her knowledge of where to find Indian camps, her influence over Sheriff Hawkins, who should have been investigating rather than executing. They searched through the ruins of the camp, looking for anything the attackers might have left behind. Most of the evidence had been consumed by flames, but Esperanza found something the fire had missed. A broken piece of bridle leather caught on a thorn bush, decorated with silver conchos in a distinctive pattern. She had seen that pattern before, on the horse Martha Caldwell rode to church every Sunday. The woman had been here, guiding the attack, making sure it was thorough enough to eliminate any inconvenient truths. As they prepared to leave the destroyed camp, the old woman pressed something into Esperanza's hands. It was a small pouch made from soft deer hide, filled with herbs that smelled of sage and sweetgrass. She spoke words that sounded like blessing and warning combined. "For protection," Ayana said, "and for courage when the time comes to speak truth." They left as the sun touched the western mountains, painting the sky the color of blood and fire. Behind them, the old woman watched from the ruins of her world, a guardian of memory and witness to loss. The main camp lay 2 days' ride to the north, hidden in a canyon where water ran clean and grass grew thick enough to feed horses through the winter. By the time they reached it, the survivors from the burned settlements had already arrived, their faces hollow with shock and displacement. Ayanna was greeted not as a returning hero, but as a bringer of disaster. The war chief, a man whose face bore the scars of a dozen battles, listened to his son's report with eyes that revealed nothing. When Ayanna finished speaking, the silence stretched long enough for Esperanza to count her own heartbeats. The chief spoke one word in their language. Ayanna flinched as if struck. "What did he say?" Esperanza asked. "Exile." The word carried the weight of death. To be cut off from his people, from the land that had shaped him, was worse than dying in battle. It was a slow dissolution of everything that made him who he was. "Unless," Ayanna continued, his voice barely above a whisper, "I can undo what my actions have caused." A messenger arrived before dawn, riding hard from the direction of Cedar Ridge. His horse was lathered with sweat and foam, pushed beyond endurance by the urgency of his news. The message was brief and brutal. Return to Cedar Ridge for public trial, or watch 100 families burn. Sheriff Hawkins would attack at noon unless the fugitives surrendered themselves to face justice. Esperanza looked at the sleeping camp, at children who had already lost one home and might lose another, at old people who had survived too many winters to die by fire and steel, at warriors who would fight to the last breath, but could not stop bullets with courage alone. The choice was no choice at all. They would return to Cedar Ridge and face whatever waited for them there. But not as victims led to slaughter. This time they would go armed with truth and the kind of desperate courage that came from having nothing left to lose. As the sun rose over the canyon rim, casting long shadows, across the camp Esperanza fingered the small stone bird Ayanna had carved for her. Hope, he had called it. Perhaps it was time to see if hope was stronger than hate. The Harvest Festival had transformed Cedar Ridge into something almost beautiful. Paper lanterns hung between buildings like captured fireflies. The smell of roasted corn and apple cider masked the usual odors of horse manure and unwashed bodies. Children ran between the stalls, their laughter bright as silver coins. Most of the men were in the fields, bringing in the last of the wheat before the weather turned. This left the town populated mostly by women, children, and old men who moved, slowly and saw poorly. Perfect conditions for what Esperanza and Ayanna had planned. They entered Cedar Ridge as the sun reached its peak, splitting up at the edge of town like water flowing around a stone. Esperanza had traded her ruined wedding dress for simple traveling clothes taken from the Comanche camp. A brown wool skirt, and white cotton blouse that made her look like any other woman come to trade at the festival. Ayanna moved through the shadows between buildings, invisible as smoke. His destination was the sheriff's office, where Martha Caldwell's correspondence with the cavalry would be kept. Evidence of her real crimes, carefully documented in military reports. Esperanza's target was the Caldwell house itself, where Martha's gambling debts lay hidden like poison in a well. The woman had been careful, but desperation made people careless. Somewhere in that house were the IOUs that would unravel her web of lies. The Caldwell house sat on a rise overlooking the town, its white clappered walls gleaming in the afternoon sun. Martha and Thomas would be at the festival, playing their roles as pillars of the community. The house stood empty, its windows dark as closed eyes. Esperanza found the hidden key where servants always left them, under the third flower pot on the back porch. The door opened with a whisper of hinges that needed oil. Inside, the house smelled of lavender and secrets. She moved through the rooms like a ghost, searching with the methodical patience of someone who had cleaned enough houses to know their hidden places. Behind books that were never read, in the false bottom of a jewelry box, sewn into the lining of a winter coat. The gambling markers were in Martha's sewing basket, tucked between spools of thread and packets of needles. Dozens of them, written in different hands but all bearing Martha's signature. debts to card games and horse races that added up to more money than most people saw in a lifetime. Among the papers, Esperanza found something else. Letters from a cavalry officer named Captain Morrison, promising protection from Indian raids in exchange for information about tribal movements. The handwriting was cramped and urgent, the kind that came from a man who had discovered blackmail, was more profitable than his army pay. Martha Caldwell was not just a gambler, she was a spy, trading lives for security and using her debts as leverage against anyone who might expose her. Esperanza gathered the evidence and made her way back to the festival, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird. The hardest part was still ahead. She had to stand before the same people who had tied her to a wagon wheel and convince them that everything they believed was a lie. The festival crowd had gathered in the town square, the same space where her public shaming had taken place. A wooden platform had been erected for speeches and presentations. Martha Caldwell stood upon it now, her gray hair pinned back in its usual severe style, speaking about community values and the importance of standing together against outside threats. Esperanza waited at the edge of the crowd until Martha finished her speech. Then she stepped forward, moving through the gathered people like a knife through silk. Conversations died as they recognized her. Hands reached for weapons that were not there. Children were pulled closer to their mothers' skirts. She climbed the platform steps with steady legs, her spine straight as a rifle barrel. Martha's face went white as fresh snow when she saw her. The woman's mouth opened and closed without sound, like a fish pulled from water. "People of Cedar Ridge," Esperanza said, her voice carrying across the square. "You know me. You tied me to a wagon wheel and called me a thief. Today I stand before you with proof of who the real criminal is." She reached into her bag and pulled out the gambling markers, holding them high where everyone could see. "Martha Caldwell owes more money than this town makes in a year. She has been selling information about Indian movements to the cavalry, using your safety as a cover for her crimes." The crowd stirred like a nest of disturbed hornets. Voices rose in anger and confusion. Some called for Esperanza to be seized. Others demanded to see the evidence for themselves. Thomas Caldwell pushed through the crowd, his face slack with shock and dawning understanding. When he reached the platform, he looked up at his mother with eyes that held more pain than accusation. "Mother," he said, and the single word carried the weight of a lifetime's disappointment. Martha found her voice at last. "She's lying. Those papers are forgeries. This woman is a criminal and a fraud." But her protests sounded hollow even to her own ears. The evidence was too detailed, too specific to be fabricated. Captain Morrison's letters described Indian camps with precision that could only come from someone who had seen them firsthand. Ayana emerged from the crowd like a specter, his arms full of official documents from the sheriff's office. He climbed the platform and stood beside Esperanza, no longer hiding his intelligence behind broken English. "Sheriff Hawkins has been taking orders from Mrs. Caldwell for months," he said, his voice clear and strong. "Every raid, every burned camp, every family scattered to the wind, all to cover up her gambling debts and her deal with corrupt cavalry officers." The crowd was silent now, the weight of truth settling over them like dust after a storm. They had been used, manipulated into becoming a mob by someone who saw their fear as a tool to be exploited. Thomas Caldwell climbed onto the platform, his movement slow and deliberate. He reached into his coat and pulled out a leather pouch that clinked with the sound of gold coins. "This belongs to you," he said to Esperanza. "All of it. I should have stood up to her from the beginning." Martha made one last desperate attempt to maintain control. "You're all fools. She's bewitched you with her lies. This Indian savage is using her to destroy our town." But the crowd had heard enough. They surged forward, not to harm Esperanza and Ayana, but to demand answers from the woman who had betrayed their trust. Martha Caldwell, pillar of the community, was dragged from the platform by the same people who had once hung on her every word. Sheriff Hawkins arrived with his remaining deputies drawn by the commotion, but instead of arresting the fugitives, he found himself facing a town that knew the truth about his corruption. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable. Within an hour, both he and Martha were locked in their own jail cells. The sun was setting by the time the immediate crisis passed. Esperanza and Ayana stood at the edge of Cedar Ridge, watching the last light fade from the western sky. The town had offered them sanctuary, even a reward for exposing the corruption that had nearly destroyed them all. But neither felt the pull to stay. Cedar Ridge would always be the place where they had been bound and humiliated, where their trust in human decency had been broken and slowly rebuilt. They needed somewhere new, somewhere that belonged to them alone. "Where will you go?" Thomas asked. He had followed them to the town's edge, his face aged years in a single day. Esperanza looked at Ayana, seeing her own thoughts reflected in his dark eyes. "Somewhere between your world and his," she said. "Somewhere we can build something new." 6 months later, a trading post appeared on the land between Cedar Ridge and the Comanche settlements. It was run by a black woman and an Indian man who had learned that justice was not something you waited for, but something you built with your own hands. Children from both communities played in the dusty yard while their parents conducted business. The sound of laughter carried on the wind, mixing languages and cultures in ways that would have been impossible before two outcasts showed the world what courage looked like. Esperanza stood in the doorway of her new home, watching Ayana approach. With a delegation from his tribe, the small stone bird he had carved for her rested in her pocket, worn smooth by countless touches. Hope, given form and substance. The world was still hard, still full of people who judged by skin color and heritage rather than character. But here, in this small corner of Texas, something different was growing, something that proved love and respect could take root in the most unlikely soil. And that is all to the story for now. Please let me know where you are tuning in from. Perhaps we will create a story there. Consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel. And if you enjoy our content, click this video on your screen. I promise you it's worth watching. See you tomorrow.